Hello, my project is about Romance in Marseille, a book that we read early in this semester during the Harlem Renaissance unit. And this book was written by Claude McKay, a very prominent Harlem Renaissance writer. He was born in Jamaica, which was under British colonial rule at the time. And this project's thesis will be focusing on how he develops two similar yet very different characters and how that relates to his own interpersonal struggles. So, first, some historical context of Romance in Marseille. America in the 1930s, which when this book was written, was not very ideal for African Americans. Jim Crow laws in the South not only allowed but enforced segregation, and this is also mirrored by the North's distaste for recent black migrants in search of work. Most have lived in segregated neighborhoods in big cities like Chicago, Detroit, and most importantly, New York City. Certain neighborhoods that were majority black fueled the Harlem Renaissance, from where it got its name, a social and artistic movement for and by African Americans. The Great Depression did not depress poets like Langston Hughes, activists like W. B. Du Bois, and musicians like Louis Armstrong. During this time, writers like Claude McKay wrote about the racial discrimination of America and bolstered the Pan-African movement, which asserted black equality and unity. His book, Romance in Marseille, may not be explicitly about race as his other bestseller called Amiable with Big Teeth, but it's a very important theme. So, quick summary of the novel. It follows a West African man named La Falla, and he lives in Marseille, which is a port city in France, southern France. He falls in love with a Moroccan woman named Aslima. However, she betrays him for a man named Titin, and he gets robbed, loses all his fortune. So, because he's so frustrated with being embarrassed and broke, he stows away on a ship to New York City. But he's discovered by the ship's captain and is locked up for several weeks in cold conditions. He has to get his leg amputated because it's frozen, and he ends up suing the shipping company with the help of a lawyer and makes $100,000. So he returns to Marseille and meets his ex, Aslima, and he nearly falls back in love with her again. However, for most of the story, he is cautious of her because of her initial betrayal. It turns out that Aslima actually was loyal this time, but she is killed by Titin, who is envious of her love for Laval. So my thesis is that the most integral way that McKay communicates ideas on race is through how he develops his characters, specifically La Falla and Babel, the West Indies man who jumped ship with him. Both men evidently have many things in common. However, it's what's different about them that's integral to understanding the story. Each character represents two versions of the black race. Babel, the stereotypical one, and La Falla, the mob minority. Both have their pitfalls, which is proved in the story. So, one way to reveal a character's underlying purpose is through their dialogue and diction. McKay utilizes how Babel speaks to convey that he is a stereotypical black man. His grammar is poor, which shows he has lack of education. This is apparent throughout the story, but I saw particularly on page 86, one of the first times that his character is introduced, that he has poor grammar, a very limited vocabulary, compared to La Falla, who speaks with proper grammar. He has high vocabulary than most of the other black characters. He pronounces his words accurately and speaks in complex sentences. Both characters represent McKay to some extent. Babel is how a lot of people, especially white people in Jamaica, viewed him as being uneducated because of his race, although he was taught by many famous poets. And La Falla is how he viewed himself as being a very well-read person. So, why is dialogue important for a character? Well, it communicates a lot of things, like their motivations and their emotions, but it also communicates their intelligence and education level, as well as their social class. And you can see the huge gap between Lafala and Babel here, and how a lot of people viewed Mackay at the time, other poets, especially ones who were white and didn't know him very well, compared to how people view him now and how he viewed himself. Similarly, another sign of low intelligence or lack of education is the inability to look at things from more than one perspective. Being the archetype of an uneducated man, Babel sees things as black and white, good or bad, with little to no intermediate area. From the time that he reunites with Lafala to his last appearance in the novel, he tries to convince Lafala to leave the Slima. His close-mindedness makes him believe that since she betrayed his friend in the past, she can never be trusted again. Near the end of Romance, Babel makes a last-ditch attempt to persuade Lafala against marrying Aslima when he says, "She gypped you once for a white tout and she'll do it again," on page 113. The author is using Babel as a classic example of an ignorant black man who has an opinion on Aslima's new character when he hasn't met her yet. He's made conjectures purely on what others have told him without seeking the truth himself. A direct foil to Babel is Lafala, who fell back in love with Aslima even after she sold him out. It's very likely that he's simply acting on his own arousal, as he was wary of her the first time he arrived in Marseille, and even hostile. The first time that he meets up with Aslima, she expresses her regret in having a roll lost of his legs, but Lafala does not initially forgive her, and maliciously says, "That's a present from you," on page 33, excuse me. However, over time, he makes observations like how she refuses to accept payment for her companionship. To him, it means that she doesn't see him as a customer anymore, but that his status has been elevated. She protects Lafala from Tintin when he attacks him, the exact opposite of what she did before he stood away on the ship. After taking all this into account, Lafala decides that he can trust her. This represents McKay's true character because he certainly was an open-minded individual since he participated in the Harlem Renaissance, actively spoke for black civil rights. Again, we see the two versions of the black race, the interpretation by white Americans at the time, and McKay's vision of liberated, self-taught people. An important part of a person's personality and a character's identity is their temperament. Temperament is a collection of traits that predicts how well or how somebody reacts to outside events. We see that Lafala and Babel's responses to similar circumstances are polar opposites, further dividing the two characters. Part of a person's temper is how easy they are to provoke. Babel demonstrates that he has a quick-to-anger personality type, as it doesn't take much to get a reaction out of him. He is very verbally aggressive toward Saint Dominique when he's accused of selling out Lafala to authorities, which would have caused his arrest, although he's not given much evidence of this. When Saint Dominique speaks articulately as he always does, Babel suddenly takes it personally, thinking that he is mocking Babel's lack of education compared to the Martinican man who had been to university. This could be viewed as yet another example of Babel reaffirming the negative stereotype of African Americans as being less refined than white people. Dominique himself is half white. It also represents black people who have been either wronged or perceived to have been wronged in this case by the majority. And when they spoke up about it, sometimes angrily, they were simply labeled as savages. Lafala, however, acts like the model minority and is gracious to nearly everybody he meets. As mentioned earlier, he finds it in his heart to trust Aslima after a catastrophic betrayal by his lover. Later, he even forgives Tintin for attempting to kill him, while not knowing that he was not at all repentant. Thus, one could say that Lafala takes his mildness to the extreme and becomes almost naive. Finally, a character's physical description cannot be left unanalyzed. Yet again, Babel seems to fit the mold of what others perceive black people to be. While Lafala is unique, and unlike the others, does not fit into the rigidly defined racial categories. Babel is described on page 85 as being a, quote, huge West Indian. Interestingly, a 2017 study indicates that people of all races perceive black men as being bigger than they actually are. The narrator who is describing all of these characters may not really be Mackay's opinions, but the opinions of an outsider observing. The author's real message is portrayed through the actions and traits of the characters themselves. Additionally, the author mentions that when Babel lands in the port near Genoa, he plants himself like a big banana tree, on page 85. It's interesting that the author chooses to compare Babel to a banana tree specifically. A possible explanation for this simile is the simile that some people in the 20th century used to liken black people to animals, specifically monkeys or apes. As a result, they associate bananas with them. In some instances, black people have even had banana peels thrown at them, like the former Integration Minister of Italy, Cecile Kyenge, and the Brazilian winger Vinicius Jr. And these banana peels are thrown by French fans, similar to how many of the characters in this novel are francophones. We see that Lafala, on the other hand, is described as being less of a stereotype than his counterpart Babel. He's described as being very, quote, handsome with arresting eyes and a fine protruding forehead topped by a mat of closely weaved black hair, on page 7. They also mention that he has extremely dark skin, and it's not very difficult to see that his attractiveness is despite his blackness, not because of it. The other black patient in the hospital is treated with disdain because he's black and unattractive. Mackay is driving the point home that everyone can be superficial at times, no matter their race, as Lafala also dislikes the other black patient before he even spoke to him. In the eyes of the narrator, and therefore common opinion at the time, beauty signaled good character, which is not necessarily the case in real life. Through a character's education level, personality traits, and physical description, one can determine what they are supposed to represent in the story. In Romance in Marseille, Mackay utilizes the opposing characters Babel and Lafala to portray an archetypal versus idealized version of black people. It's known that Mackay cared deeply about asserting social equality because he was a prominent Harlem Renaissance writer and champion of civil rights. Babel is not introduced until near the end of the story because it's not his actions that are important, but his overall character type. Lafala, though he's supposed to be the better version, is still wronged by society. He loses his legs and as a result unable to walk after being placed in inhumane conditions. This symbolizes how racism limited people's ability to better their position in society, even if they were hard-working, good people like Lafala. This parallels another book for this semester, The Buddha in the Attic by Julia Tsuka, in which model minorities are praised by their employers but rarely rewarded for their efforts. Later, the racism and xenophobia they experience leads to their confinement in internment camps, similar to